Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series where we're looking at Auto 5s. These are the long recoil shotguns that the Browning Auto 5 either inspired or those shotguns that were derived from it, really looking at the history of the automatic shotgun through the lens of Browning's original long recoil design. And today's example that we're looking at would be very easy to mistake with being an actual Browning. It looks like one, it feels like one, it shoots like one, and with only a few exceptions, all of the parts on this gun interchange one for one with the Browning examples. Some of you may already have an inclination as to what this gun may be. You may be saying, well, it's not an actual Belgian Browning, right, but it's a Japanese Browning. Well, it is a Japanese Auto 5 clone, but it's not a Japanese Browning. It's a Japanese Auto 5 clone of a Browning. And in today's video, we'll be taking a look at how this gun works, a little bit about its history, where it came from, how it got imported to the US, as well as a few unique things about this particular shotgun. Now, as a prefatory thing, this shotgun comes from a period of time in Japanese shotgun manufacturing where the makers and manufacturers and a lot of that corporate structure is sort of clouded with mystery. I've made a video previously where we tried to untangle a little bit of that web, and I'll try and avoid reiterating too much from that video as we jump into things here. However, the relevant pieces of information is that in the post-war years, there was a great big juggernaut in Japanese commercial shotgun manufacture, which is known as the Kawaguchi Firearms Company. The Kawaguchi Firearms Company really more or less contracted with a lot of manufacturers there in Japan saying, why don't you make this, why don't you make this, put our branding on it and we'll market it to the international markets, and then we'll then make money that way, right? You make shotguns for us, we market them, we'll make the money from the importers, and then we'll pay you to make the guns. So in this way, they were really like an import-export middleman, like a manager of these companies, is a one way to think about it. One of the companies that KFC would sort of contract with was the Pine Company. Pine Company had previously made sewing machines. They had hard times after World War II making sewing machines, and the Singer Sewing Machine Company in the United States bought them out, and eventually the Pine Company would establish a firearms division. This would be known as the Pine Singer Firearms Division, or sometimes just the Pine Firearms Division. And while this division didn't really exist for a very long time and didn't make a great number of guns, one of the guns that did end up bearing its name is a series of Auto 5 copies that would be known themselves under a bunch of separate names. These names would include things as generic as the KFC Automatic, or the Pine Automatic, or the Singer Automatic, or later the Singer Nikko Automatic, or the Daiwa 500, Daiwa being a fishing reel manufacturing company that had also marketed other products in the United States and would market these particular shotguns under their own trade name here in the US and also in Europe, which sort of complicates things because you've now got like 5 different names. Daiwa would sometimes call it the Auto 500 or just the Daiwa Auto, so we've got now like 6 or 7 names established for this gun. However, insofar as getting imported to the United States, the first name that this gun was known as is the SL18. And today we have an example of an SL18 here to show off. Now, understanding what makes the SL18 special is going to require us to back up just a little bit. Here in the United States, there was a great big outdoors sporting goods company known as Herter's that had existed for quite a while. Really, post-World War II up until kind of fell apart in the 70s, it was sort of the name. So think about Cabela's or Bass Pro today. Herter sort of laid the groundwork for how that sort of a store would operate. They'd get sporting goods from all over the world and then market them here in the US. Herter's was largely a mail order thing, so they'd mail out a catalog every month or quarterly or parts of the years where a lot of people are spending a lot of money. They'd send out catalogs saying you can get fishing reels or tents or hunting decoys or duck calls or vests or gear, all these sorts of things. But in a United States that was pre-1968, Herter's could mail order guns as well. So Herter's would have a gun section where they'd have a list of guns that you could send them a check in the mail and they would then ship you a gun to your house. Now, a lot of these guns that Herter's would market would be questionable quality, but a few of them would be noteworthy standouts. Some of these would be decent quality over-under shotguns they'd import from Japan, but the one that's notable to us today is the SL18. Now, while the exact details of how Herter's ended up configuring and then importing one of these KFC automatics into the US are a little unclear to us, I think it's reasonable to assume that Herter's was aware of or had a finger on the pulse of the Japanese firearm market at this time because Herter's was importing fishing equipment, and Japan being an island nation deals in a lot of fishing equipment, so Herter's must have been aware at some rate of this economy, of this market that was going on in Japan, and had certainly also been importing cheaper, lower-end firearms from Japan already. And I think this is a reasonable way that we can expect they came into knowing of KFC's plans to make this automatic. KFC's first automatics that were patterned after the Auto 5 had really only been in existence for a year or two by the time the Herter's SL18 gets configured. Now, when I say configured, what I mean is the traditional KFC Auto, Nikko Auto, Singer Auto, Pine Auto, are typically all featured and furnished in a relatively standard way. Yes, they had grades, they had different engraving or checkering, or finishes, or even receiver materials that would be available throughout the production span of the gun. But most of the time, the stocks fit the same way, and the forends felt the same way, and the way that the big parts of the gun were actually shaped didn't have much variety to them. Now, one major difference that the SL18 has from these other guns is the SL18 has a much longer stock with a little bit of a lower comb and a much fuller pistol grip. You'll see on a lot of Japanese shotguns, especially from this period, stocks that are maybe set up more to fit an Asiatic build than your sort of corn-fed American build, where stocks are generally shorter, with much higher combs and much slimmer pistol grips on guns that were maybe intended with a little bit more of a, what a Japanese gun company would consider a universal fit, which would include people who live in Japan. When of course you have an average stature difference of between a Japanese man and an American man that are quite substantial, especially at this point in time. But that said, there were also a few aesthetic cues that Herters opted to do. A gold-plated trigger was not always standard on the Japanese production guns. However, Herters opted for a gold trigger, a little bit of stylized engraving, squiggling around the receiver edges, which is a thing that Browning had introduced on their Auto 5s, especially post-war. You'll find that receivers squiggling just sort of made to break up the lines of the gun and make it look maybe a little bit more refined or really a little bit more expensive. Additionally, Herters would opt to go ahead and slap his face on the side of the gun. As you can see there, instead of our traditional Browning and then Browning's face, we have Herter's, and then a picture of George Herter. Now, George Herter was a little bit of an interesting figure. Perhaps one very interesting thing about his motif being on the side of this gun is he was a person who was forcefully opposed to having his picture taken. There's really only 2 or 3 pictures of George Herter that exist out there, which is odd because, people these days don't really know about him, but back in the day, he was really one of these larger-than-life folk hero, gets talked about in gun magazines. People would always be knocking on his doors for interviews and want to talk about his company or his products or his thought process or these sorts of things. He was a published author who had 7 or 8 books. His books weren't always the most critically acclaimed. In fact, some of his books were accused of being poorly researched and completely made up. And I've read a couple of excerpts from these books. They are certainly, let's say, steeped in folklore, but I think this really all just adds to the mythos of who George Herter was. Further evidence of George's antics can be found in the way that he would do his mail order ads. He would frequently have a new product that people wouldn't be very familiar with, and he would advertise this product as having received some award or commendation or best-in-class certification from, name it, XYZ outdoor groups, like the North Star Outer Sporting Guides group. Only this group wouldn't exist. It would just be a completely fictional group that George had made up to make his product sound more interesting. And while I understand that this does sort of seem somewhat underhanded as far as business practices go, I think it's sort of an interesting insight into maybe who George Herter was, and I think it makes this particular gun that much more interesting where, George Herter would certainly have been aware that the Browning Auto 5 in this 1965, 1967 timeframe, the Auto 5 isn't the undisputed king of the shotgun market anymore, with things like the Remington 1100 every year getting a larger slice of the market share. But the Auto 5 still holds that place of being the gun that people with money want to buy because when they were kids, this was the coolest gun that existed. And so I think it's interesting, right, that George Herter would see a Japanese company making an Auto 5 clone, and he figures, let's gussy it up a little more. Once we take the gun apart, we'll see it has 1 or 2 features that sort of make it better, at least in a theoretical sense, than the Browning shotguns. Slap his face on the side of the thing, and then mail order them out across the country. However, George Herter's company would end up falling on tough times after the passage of the Gun Control Act because the 1968 Gun Control Act, among other things, made it very difficult to import guns. It also made it very difficult to sell guns for companies that were in the country already, because previously they had been able to mail order guns and didn't have this system of federal firearms licensees, whereas after the 68 Gun Control Act, in order to sell a gun between states, the gun had to go from a federal firearms licensee to another federal firearms licensee, and then from that licensee to the actual intended buyer. This greatly complicated the business model of Herter's, and it had a further wider reaching effect across the entire United States gun industry because, sort of with a flip of the switch, the companies did have a couple of months to get ready for it, but the year prior, 1967, you could just sell guns interstate, it's not a big deal. You could sell guns without being an FFL for the purpose of making money without it being a big deal, right? The whole gun show sale of guns, wheeling, dealing was fine. Nobody had a problem with that until 1968 when all of this stuff sort of gets introduced. And the way that it gets introduced is that you really have less than a year to A, learn that it exists in a pre-internet world, B, figure out how you're going to get your FFL, and then C, figure out how an FFL is going to buy a gun. Of course, these days we're sort of spoiled with the way the internet works, where you can just write an email to the person selling the gun and say, send it to my FFL here, and they can exchange FFLs via email. Back in 1968, they had to mail this paperwork back and forth, and it would, a process that used to be put a check in the mail, get your gun, show up at your doorstep, became you're going to go ahead and go to your gun store. If that's previously, right, if you wrote to your gun store, well, now you're going to write to them and say, I want to buy this gun. That gun store now has to find who has the gun, exchange FFLs and information, get the gun in there, and then get the gun shipped to you. But if the place that has the gun doesn't have their FFL set up yet, because A, they haven't learned it exists, so it's not something they're aware to do, or B, they're waiting on it to be processed still, you're just stuck there waiting. So the US gun market sort of freezes for a year, year and a half there. Of course, the big manufacturers didn't have problems with this because, right, they're the ones that the government was most concerned about, and they were able to get FFLs easily. But these smaller mom and pop stores are kind of caught by surprise by this. So there's a little bit of stagnation that happens as a result of this. This stagnation hurts Herters pretty badly, and they start to immediately withdraw from the firearms market to some extent. Herters had examples of SL18 still in inventory that they were trying to get in from Japan, but now that there's this whole FFL system, it's complicated their ability to get the guns in, and it's complicated their ability to get the guns out. In fact, you'll find a Guns Digest review of this gun from 1972, and the guns were out of production by 1972. Herters hadn't imported them for 3 years at that point, and the guy who had that gun had pre-ordered it at the very end of 1968, right after the GCA went into effect. And he had waited 3 years to get his hands on the gun because of the sort of shakeup that had happened. Now, did all of the industry get thrown off by 3 years? No, probably not. It really seems like Herters was just slow to respond. But I think it's sort of an interesting view into the way that that sort of went down was it sort of shook things up and really did run some businesses into the ground. Now, Herters would go on and live for a few more years, but the whole mail order of outdoors things slowly started to wane, and they had expanded their company too quickly. Then eventually the Herters brand would be sold and then resold, and I believe today is owned by Bass Pro and Cabela's, and it's really just used to rebrand Winchester's commercial ammunition to be sold at Bass Pro and Cabela's. So it's unfortunate that it worked out that way for Mr. Herter's company, but I am still very glad that this gun was able to exist and that we're going to be able to show off an example of it here today. Now, before we get to the overall looks of this thing and sort of taking it apart and seeing how it's different from an Auto 5, we have a few more sort of interesting quirks and tie-ins with the Gun Control Act to cover about this specific gun's history. Now, this gun's serial number is 155. This gun was sold to its original purchaser just a few months before the Gun Control Act went into effect. And the reason we know this is this gun came with its original box and all of its original sales paperwork, which is a really, really cool thing because, again, we've got another time capsule into that GCA passage era, and we'll go ahead and take a quick look through some of this paperwork, sort of to get a better idea and understand what it was like to buy a gun back in 1968. On the front of the box here, we have a little bit of Herter's branding, right? We have their logo, which is a seahorse and a deer, together with cross guns and fishing hooks, right? It's really emphasizing, hey, look, we do outdoors stuff. However, the more interesting part is that this is the finest handcrafted automatic shotgun model SL18 Deluxe Royal Grade. That's really good stuff right there. Now, what did Deluxe Royal Grade really mean? It means that it had slightly better checkering than the standard KFC Autos. It had a little bit more engraving and a picture of George Herter. It had a gold trigger and it had a polished chrome bolt. Otherwise, there really wasn't much difference from the rest of them, so certainly a lot of very fanciful marketing going on here. And before this box was all tarnished, I've seen pictures of these boxes in better condition. It was a very attractive gold foil. I think the camera will hopefully pick up a little bit of the sort of reflectiveness of it, but this one's got a little bit of degradation that's going on. Additionally, in the box, we learned that it's made of the most expensive ordnance steels, all parts precision machined from solid blocks of steel, lavishly hand engraved. It's got a ventilated rib, and so far as I've been able to tell, this was a standard feature on all of the SL18s, as they all had vented ribs, and they all had mid-beads on them. And what's meant by a mid-bead, if you're not familiar, is that the shotgun has a front bead, of course, for aiming, but it also has a smaller bead in the middle of the rib that makes sort of the alignment and acquisition of your sight view a little bit quicker, and it's at least a little bit easier to get it dead centered up. But mid-beads are not a thing that becomes very popular until much later in history. Certainly 1965 timeframe, 1965 to 1967, is pretty darn early to be seeing a mid-bead, especially on a shotgun that wasn't like a made in very small numbers for a specific competition audience sort of thing. So that is one interesting quirk there. However, I should mention that the other KFC Autos would be available in a ribless configuration. It's just the SL18 specifically that were sort of rib only. I've never seen one that from the factory lacked the rib, if that makes sense. Additionally, here on the box, we see that we have dense grain French walnut stock and forearm precision hand checkered. It's not the best checkering ever. The checkering that's on these is a little bit better than the checkering that you'll find on the sort of regular KFC automatics, Daiwa automatics, Singer automatics. However, this checkering is substantially worse than you'll find on Brownings of the period or the later Japanese Browning Auto 5s. You got worse checkering going on here. That's the fine checkering. The good checkering they're bragging of isn't that great. Finally, treat this gun with loving care. It is the finest of its kind in the world. That's a really good feature to advertise on your box. Treat this gun with loving care. It is the finest of its kind in the world. And in some regards, I will give it. It does have some features to it that are better than the Auto 5. However, that's certainly a little bit of marketing fluff there. It's not, I would not say in totality this is a better gun than the Auto 5. It's got a couple of design improvements. The fit and finish is nearly as good. The checkering is nearly as good, but it's across the board not nearly as good of a gun. Anyway, moving on, the front side of the box, got the same picture, more or less the same information. On the end of the box, we can see that we have barrel length. I believe other barrel lengths were available, but 28-inch was kind of the standard. Other chokes were, of course, available. Mine's improved modified, which is cool because I like improved modified. We've got our serial number, and then the width of our rib. As far as I can tell, other rib widths were not offered with these guns. However, different width ribs were a thing, especially with ribs then being viewed as more of a luxury thing or a high-end thing, more so than these days are sort of thought of as standard, and it's weird when you don't have them on shotguns. Ribs back then were, it's a deluxe thing, right? It's a luxury that you can have on your gun. And so variable width ribs was certainly something that existed more back then than these days. Usually manufacturers make a gun and it's got one width on the rib. But back in the days when manufacturers didn't offer their own ribbed barrels and they would have, contract out to companies like Simmons to put a rib on their barrels that they would then have factory delivered to you, variable width ribs were a thing, so that's sort of why it says that. Finally, looking at the bottom of the box, plain cardboard. This end of the box, same information we've seen before. And at this point, we are ready to take a peek inside. Now, here in the box, we had foam with bubble wrap. We have our original butt plate. The butt plates on these guns were made out of like the most fragile, dissolvable plastic. It crumbles into pieces. If you look at just even this piece up close, it's got lots and lots of little micro fractures going on in it. I think it's just some sort of composite that's broken down in the many years the shotgun has been around since it was manufactured. So most of the time that you find these KFC automatics, if you've got one with the original butt plate, I recommend you take that butt plate off and not shoot with it, because finding an intact butt plate is rather rare. I just 3D printed a replacement butt plate for this stock, and that's been working okay so far. Moving on, we have the paperwork that came with this gun. The first bit of paperwork is a little pamphlet from Herter's that sort of explains the impending nature of the Gun Control Act, sort of explaining this is how the law is going to change, this is what's going to happen. Moving on, it sort of lays out the exact text of the law. And then Herter sort of lays out like, hey, if your local gun store doesn't have an FFL, get them this information or we won't be able to ship them guns. Then Herter explains that this is going to, you really put the pinch on their business, it's going to cause them trouble. And they were sort of asking their customers to have their local mom and pop shops make sure they got their FFLs, because otherwise Herter's would be in a situation where they couldn't ship your gun to them for them to sell it to you, as had been done previously, now that this system of FFLs was required. Then finally on the back of this pamphlet, we have their logo. Really just sort of an interesting time capsule where at one point in time there was a sort of panic in the gun buying public that this was all going to go into effect. And remember, December 16th, 1968 is the date that the GCA would become effective. We'll see with the shotgun's original bill of sale that it was sold only a few months before that point. Moving on, here we have the manual for the shotgun. No finer automatic shotgun made. Again, we're really laying it on thick here. Guaranteed for the life of the purchaser. Well, that doesn't do me any good. Also, Herter's probably didn't last as long as the original purchaser of a lot of these, because the company went away not too long thereafter. But the manual has very basic information about the Auto 5. It's really just taking the barrel on and off of the gun. It says, things like what loads it's compatible with. It also talks about if you need more work done to the gun than taking the barrel on and off, you should consult your gunsmith. Finally, on the back, we can go ahead and fill out our warranty card, and maybe we can send it in. Yeah, that's not going to work. Additionally, here we have a diagram for the setting of the friction rings. We have our instructions for the setting of light loads and our instructions for the setting of heavy loads. Of course, this was sort of the drawback to the Auto 5, is that these sort of instructions were not always published or available with the guns when you'd buy them. And so people would sort of confuse themselves into thinking the guns only worked with heavy loads, or the guns would shoot heavy loads very violently and it would beat them and the gun up, them not realizing that the gun's got a very smart adjustable system built into it, right? That Browning friction ring system. That people didn't, especially in the pre-internet age, you can really forgive people for not understanding how that system works, because if you didn't have that information available to you, it certainly would have been hard to find. I don't know where you would have found it, because it's not like gun magazines were constantly saying, hey, check your friction rings, hey, check your friction rings, the way that, I guess, people on like Reddit or things these days, when they buy an Auto 5, people will tell them, check the condition of the springs, check how the friction rings are set. That didn't exist back then. And I think that sort of contributed to the Auto 5 having a reputation of people saying it's either the best shotgun ever, if they understood the friction rings, it doesn't cycle my particular loads because they didn't understand the friction rings, or the gun cycles so violently it beats me up, it's got the worst recoil ever, because again, they didn't understand the friction system. Moving on here, we have a parts diagram for the shotgun. There's a couple interesting things to note here. The first is that the two-part Browning carrier is depicted here. Now, this gun was of course made and sold in 1967. The earliest of these guns was made in 1965. So we can say certainly by 1967, they had a two-piece carrier in Japan. Now, this would be sort of surprising to Browning because Browning had a patent to this system, right? That two-piece carrier that allows you to load the gun without pushing in the bolt release. That's something that Browning had a patent to. And KFC was certainly infringing on this with some of the automatics that they were marketing. However, this particular gun and all of the SL18s I've seen did not have the two-piece carrier, so it may have been a thing where Herter's was aware that there was a patent that Browning held for it, and Herter said, we're not getting in the middle of this. We're not going to be on the hook for having imported a patent-violating article. Give us the standard carrier and we'll be on our way. However, you will find examples, even contemporary examples around guns made around the same time period that didn't come straight into the US that will have the two-part carrier. And in that video I mentioned earlier, we sort of untangle the web of these Japanese shotgun companies. I talk at a little bit more length about the fact that Browning probably did discover this was going on, and the fact that Browning discovered that KFC wasn't making these guns, and the Pine Company probably wasn't making the guns themselves, and it was probably either Moroku or Yamamoto that was making these guns, and Browning would end up partnering up with them to make their Auto 5s for them, rather than try and pursue sort of a thing that would kill off Moroku or Yamamoto. Anyway, the few other interesting things here on this parts list. The first is we can see the chief difference that this gun has with the Auto 5, which is that in addition to a screw that comes up through the wrist of the stock and through the bottom tang to hold the stock on, we also have a hex bolt here on this that is not present on the Brownings. The introduction of the hex bolt isn't necessarily strictly an improvement. However, it's one of those things that can only stand to help because it's certainly going to hold the stock on the gun better. And while it's true that in some very high-use Auto 5s, you will find stocks that end up picking up a little bit of wiggle because that sort of tang screw wears out, or the hole in the stock wallers out for the tang screw, that's not really a very common thing. So for that reason, I don't know that I want to call this an upgrade so much as it's a feature that's technically an improvement. It's just maybe not one that's needed very much. And the final thing for us to see here on this parts list is that the receiver was a part, because again, this parts list was drawn up prior to 1968. And receivers weren't firearms prior to 1968. It was all the pieces of the gun, all the pieces of a firearm was treated as a firearm, but what a firearm meant was nothing because you could just get them through the mail, right? So it was maybe restrictions on who could possess something like a barrel existed prior to 1968, but A, it wasn't really enforced that way, and then B, it didn't mean a whole lot because you could just mail these things to the order. So it's just sort of an interesting quirk to see that the receiver is just listed as another part of the gun, whereas after 1968, you usually won't see this be the case because that's the one piece of the gun that is like getting a whole gun. Prior to 1968, all of the parts were like getting a whole gun. You gave them money and they mailed them to you. Finally here we have the original bill of sale. I don't know that it would matter, but I'm going to go ahead and hide the original purchaser's name. I'm not sure if they're still around. It'd be cool if they were, but I don't know that I'm interested in throwing their information out there like that. But we can see that this gun originally sold for $135 with $2 in postage to be able to send the money and then get the gun. But the most interesting part is here where we've got our date stamp, and it is very faint, but we've got an October 30th, 1968 there for our date. So you're really there at the beginning of November. This thing was like a month and a half away from the cutoff, right? The end of mail order guns entirely. Then finally for our paperwork, we have a copy of the bill of sale, and then we have the original gun shop it was sold through, and then the gun shop made $7 in commission, which is sort of funny to think that, I mean, ultimately their paperwork burden was a lot less back then, and that might be why they would work for such a relatively low commission compared to sort of what we deal with these days. The markup that a gun company has, plus whatever fee they're going to charge you for transfer, is usually a bit more considerable than that sum adjusted for inflation. Anyway, that sort of wraps up the paperwork there. Maybe that was a little bit boring for some people, but I felt that was kind of nice to include because A, you don't see that sort of stuff very often, and B, this gun's sort of time in history there right before the Gun Control Act makes the gun's story more interesting and really does tie into the history of the SL18 in general. But with all that discussed, we're going to put the box to the side. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the gun itself. So I mentioned a couple of differences. I characterize them as improvements that are existent here that really don't show up back in the Brownings. Really all of that is taking place here in the foreend. We'll go ahead and get that part popped off so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. And of course, this being an Auto 5 clone, the barrel comes off just like an Auto 5. We'll take our magazine cap off, slide our handguard and barrel off. There's our handguard. Here's our barrel. And our friction system. There's nothing to write home with on the friction system. It's a one-to-one dimensional copy of the Brownings. Same sort of spring, same sort of friction ring, same sort of friction band, control system, all of that. Same, we've seen it before. Our magazine tube setup, very much like the Brownings. We have a little bit of an extended thread relief here on the end, which is kind of a nice feature because you'll sometimes find Brownings where people try and put the cap on cockeyed and it'll pull threads off. Having a little bit of a start there makes it easier to get the cap centered up on there. Finally, of course, we have a magazine cutoff here, just like on the Brownings. You won't see a lot of the clones or copies or derivatives that follow in the wake of the Auto 5 incorporate a magazine cutoff, so it's interesting at least to see it done here. However, we're getting distracted. The thing we're really here to look at is this handguard. And you may be surprised to see a Franke-style plastic insert there at the front of the handguard, so that whenever the barrel comes forward on its spring, it doesn't bash into the wood. It instead hits this plastic piece, and you may be able to see the split in the top of the plastic piece. It sort of lets it compress on itself as it gets pushed forward. This creates a much more resilient system that's a lot less prone to breaking. Additionally, we have a plastic cap here on the front. Now this plastic cap is doing two things. One of them is cost savings in that it's holding the spring detent system for the magazine cap down into the wood without it having to be threaded into the wood directly, so improvement number one. Improvement two is the cap is no longer binding up on wood and trying to compress wood. It instead pushes down into this hard plastic, which is a different plastic than they made the butt pads out of because this plastic is very resilient, no signs of chips or cracking or damage to it, and it really is doing a good job, improving a weakness of the Auto 5, in that you'll find Auto 5s where this wood around this cap gets depressed from the cap. Of course, the cap's serrated, so the cap sort of grinds and rubs a little bit of wood off, as well as it compresses the wood because this cap cinches the handguard tight against the receiver. So, good improvement, certifiably a good improvement, something that the Frankes had also improved on. So, this isn't necessarily something that the Japanese had invented here. They'd borrowed this idea from the Franke, but integrating it into the Auto 5 system is a really good idea. It's smart. It's something that Browning themselves really should have done. Finally, moving backwards, we've got another thing that Browning really should have taken a look at doing, and it comes in the form of this little metal reinforcement here on the rear end of the handguard. Of course, the weakest part of the Auto 5 design is the splits that you'll get in the handguard here, and the splits and compression in the handguard that you'll get up here. The ones up here, if you get a crack, are much more severe because once it's cracked up here, the handguard's going to come in half pretty soon. The ones back here aren't as important from a structural standpoint. You can have a crack that comes halfway up the handguard here on the bottom, and it's not going to necessarily mean that the handguard will split in half from shooting it. Because ordinarily these cracks that start back here are from somebody taking the handguard and then pinching it when it's off the gun, because Of course, it's not meant to flex down there. So having steel reinforcement back here is simply brilliant. A lot of the other improved versions of the Auto 5s would incorporate some sort of reinforcement back here, but having it be this relatively simple steel bracket that just sort of sits as a cup around the handguard, and it has a pair of claws that sort of clamp into the insides of it, and then a pair of studs on the handguard that interface with 2 holes in the receiver. Pretty similar to the Remington Model 11, as an Auto 5 copy, had a similar thing where it had a peg and post alignment system to keep the handguard a little bit more constrained to the receiver. This is all really smart stuff. And the fact that it's a clone, a derivative of the Auto 5 that's only existed for a year or two, that's going to be having this exist in the United States, is really darn cool. Frankly, I think the biggest tragedy of these is that there weren't a ton of these handguards that were just made as replacements for Auto 5 handguards. Of course, you'd have to deal with the fact that you probably couldn't have these 2 studs, and you'd need a raised lip in here to have the handguard interface with the receiver the same way the Auto 5 does. But it would be nice if there was a large quantity of these improved design handguards that you could sort of throw on Auto 5s, because handguards are a wear item on Auto 5s typically. And this handguard is a lot less, it's going to wear a lot easier. It's going to take a lot more use and abuse to get this to fail compared to your conventional Auto 5 handguard. So it's cool to see that in a knockoff, of course, this is no knockoff, this is the finest quality automatic shotgun in the world, remember. But in a knockoff, it is very cool to see design improvements, right? Design improvement, design improvement, design improvement makes this handguard heads and shoulders better than the typical Browning design. Now, taking a look at the barrel, we have a barrel with a soldered on eyelet. This is okay. It's not the strongest way to make it is that you have this eyelet forged integral to the barrel so that the barrel and barrel ring here are one piece. On this gun, you have it soldered on. It's not bad to have it soldered on. Early Brownings had it soldered on. Sometimes the soldered on rings can crack off though. I don't know that I've ever seen a forged integral one fail. You'd have to be doing some really funky stuff with your gun, I think, to get a forged integral one to fail. Finally, looking back here at our barrel extension, we can see that it's chromed and it's polished, and it's a little bit, I would say, more attractive insofar as being chromed and polished compared to the Browning versions. Of course, some people don't necessarily like that flashy chrome look, but I have to say that I was of that opinion and it has grown on me. It might be because I like the Italian shotguns so much, and the Italian shotguns usually chrome the barrel extension and the bolt and the charging handle to sort of give it that flashy, shiny look there in the ejection port. I like the way that looks anymore. I can understand not liking the way that looks, but for me it does sort of make the gun look a little bit better. Coming in close to look at barrel markings, we have model SL18 proof tested for magnums. Now, people will look at this these days and go, wait, but does that mean it's a 3-inch gun? No, magnums back in the day meant like 2 3/4 loads that were maybe 4 drams or heavier. Once 3-inch became more standard, especially after the 90s when steel shot was mandated for waterfowl, Magnum mostly transitioned to meaning heavy 3-inch loads, but you'll still sometimes find that for 2 3/4, and especially back at the time of this gun, Magnums just meant those really, really heavy, for then, 2 3/4 loads. Now, these days, 4 dram isn't that heavy of a 2 3/4 load, because your shotgun load development has come a long way in the years since the 1960s, when you can get 4 3/4 and sometimes even close to 5 dram stuff in a 2 3/4 shell these days. Certainly the technology's come a long way, and the magnums this gun is talking about aren't today's magnums, though in terms of pressures you could certainly shoot today's magnums in this gun and be fine. It would just be a little harsh on recoil. The next line here on the barrel reads Herter's Firearms Division, Waseca, Minnesota. Flipping the barrel over, we have made in Japan by the Pine Company Firearms Division, 12 gauge, and then marked in metric 18.5 millimeters, 28-inch barrel, 2 3/4 chamber, improved modified choke. This is a common misspelling that you'll find on Japanese shotguns, as they'll call it improved modify, when it's improved modified. In official parlance, of course, it's just a misspelling that you'll find on Japanese guns, but improved modified choke. With those differences on the barrel looked at, we can return our attention to the receiver, where I can report the stock is slightly different in dimensions compared to a Browning. You have a little bit more sweep downwards here in the pistol grip that gives you a little bit of a more full grip than the standard Browning pistol grip. It's a little bit wider here at the bottom. I suppose you could characterize it as being more hand-filling, really. Otherwise, the stock isn't very different. I would say maybe the comb's just a smidge higher than you'll find on a lot of the Brownings. It's a little bit longer than the standard European length of fault pole that you'll find on the Auto 5s, but it's right in line with the sort of standard American market Browning Auto 5s that you'll find. And otherwise, the only difference is like we saw in that parts diagram, which is that there's a hex bolt, and you'll have to forgive me if I get this number wrong, but I believe it's a 19mm hex bolt up the rear end of the stock. You have to pop the butt pad off, get that bolt off, then take your little screw here out, and then the stock can come off of the gun. And while in the future I do plan to make a video sort of showing a detailed takedown and put together of this gun, I'm not going to pop the stock off for today because it's really not that interesting. You take the stock off and then it's an Auto 5 underneath there. Just an Auto 5 that has a bolt that comes up the rear end of the stock. Really not that different, not that novel. And to the extent that this is an improvement, it's only an improvement in the limited sense that by the time you put tons and tons of rounds through the guns, on some Auto 5s, you'll have the wood waller out around this screw through the wrist to the point where the stock just has a tiny, imperceptible amount of wiggle. Having that bolt up through the back of the stock ensures that you'll never have that wiggle show up. Of course, if you've got an Auto 5, maybe just as a little helpful hint, if you've got an Auto 5 that has that wiggle that's shown up, you can just fill that hole with wood putty, or if you use JB Weld, I won't tell anybody, then re-drill it so you can get a little bit more bearing area on that screw. So you can retighten that if you need to, if you've got one that's got a stock that's sort of shot loose, but it's not a very common thing. And for that reason, I don't feel that the bolt up the rear end of the stock is necessarily a big improvement. It's sort of like a theoretical feature that could be an improvement, but ultimately probably isn't that necessary. And so to avoid showing you guys things that you can see elsewhere or that you've already seen, we'll just go ahead, put this thing together, do a very brief shooting segment because, spoiler alert, it shoots just like an Auto 5. I guess it's got a mid-bead that makes it slightly different, but not really. It shoots and handles just like an Auto 5. It's smooth like an Auto 5, both in how the bolt works and how it feeds. And frankly, I say that as sort of praise of the thing, that this thing got so close that it's almost indiscernible. Really, besides the differences in the shape and way the furniture fits me compared to a typical Auto 5, I'd be hard-pressed to tell you if you just handed me one and I had to keep my eyes closed. If I couldn't feel the difference in this pistol grip, because it is notable there, I don't know that I could tell you the difference between the guns because they feel the same and handle the same and load the same, and it's really just as smooth as you'll find in an Auto 5. Regardless of which aspect of the Japanese shotgun market that was actually responsible for making these guns, they were made really well. And I think that's cool, especially when we usually use the term clone as a derogatory thing. This is a gun that when you call it a clone, you have to understand that clone in this context means they actually kind of just made the gun better. And while sum total, the fit and finish and quality that you're getting with a Browning is going to be a little bit better, in terms of which gun is designed better and which gun is executed better, I may end up saying that this improved forend is a big enough of a difference that any perceptible difference, okay, say you don't have a forged integral barrel hanger there, okay, that's a downside. A couple of the pieces in the gun are a little bit rough in terms of finish. You have a little bit of what looks like galling visible on a few of the parts, like here on the barrel extension. It looks to me like this piece was made by a shaper or a planer, and the material teared as it was getting rubbed off, and it didn't quite get polished up there enough. But besides a couple of those defects there, right, this gun is probably every bit as good as an actual Browning, but then you get this improved forend. And if you had to put it to me as you could have one or the other, right, you could have the... It's really more than arguable, right? You've got this decidedly better quality in fit and finish that you'd have in a Browning, or the improved design and execution that you have going on here. I think it might be a thing where maybe it wasn't just advertising hype. Maybe at one point in time this was the finest automatic shotgun that money could buy. And with that strange thought, I think we'll go ahead, get the gun put back together, do us a little bit of shooting footage, and frankly, that's my conclusions for the thing already, right? There's our conclusions, is that maybe it's arguable. I think it's a defensible argument that at one point in time, that time being there in the late 1960s, this may have been the best automatic shotgun. This may have been the best automatic shotgun that money could buy in a competition between it and the Auto 5. And if we ignore everything made in Italy, if we have to ignore all the Italians, I think this may actually be a better gun. In the context of a guy who's interested in buying a gun in 1967, 1968, than an actual Browning Auto 5. Now, these days that might not really be the case because you've got a couple of unique parts on these guns, such as the furniture that, if it breaks, you're going to be having a hard time finding a replacement because the furniture does not swap with an Auto 5. The rest of the small and internal parts will swap with Auto 5s, but the furniture won't. So these days, maybe these are better collector guns in the unique sense of they're rarer and you can't shoot them as much because if you break parts, you're going to be in for a bad time. But they're not as much a collector gun insofar as nobody cares about them. If you say that, oh, I've got one and it's better than a Browning, nobody's going to believe you. They're going to think you're lying and that you're full of it and that your Japanese knockoff McDonald's Walmart brand Auto 5 isn't as good as a real one. And so for those reasons, I'm sort of conflicted in saying that this is better without a lot of qualifications. And while I've handled the sort of like the non-SL18, so the non-deluxe royal grade ones, right? So the average quality sort of Nikko Singer, Daiwa, Pine, KFC, Auto 5 clones, I've handled a couple of the non-SL18, non-deluxe royal grades. And by and large, they have the same quirks as this gun here does, where the fit and finish is maybe a little rough on parts. The parts still work fine. It's all like, it's really just appearance, right? It's the way that the parts look maybe isn't as pretty. And that doesn't affect function ultimately. The one word of caution I'll say is that the aluminum receiver versions, which did exist in pretty small numbers and were primarily sold to the European markets, you have to be a little careful with the aluminum receiver versions because I've seen cracked receivers. I've seen receivers where the steel reinforcement on the handguard ended up wearing, wallowing out the aluminum on the receiver, which is kind of incredible. I've seen top tangs have cracks. I've seen, again, receivers have cracks at the bottom pinholes. So the aluminum receiver ones, probably not nearly as good quality. But for the steel receiver ones, across all the examples I've seen and handled, I think this lesson holds true that maybe not as good fit and finish, but the features, especially in the handguard and the way everything is executed here, is pretty fantastic. And it's probably better in a limited context of when these were originally sold, they were cheaper than Brownings, usually quite a bit cheaper than Brownings. They have that improved forend, so you're not going to have to worry about breaking those. However, these days, they probably function more as undesirable collector's pieces than anything else. And so with my conclusory thoughts already wrapped up on this gun, I'll go ahead and say that if you guys want to support this video or videos like this, you can do so down in the description. I've got a link to my Patreon. If you can support me there, I greatly appreciate it. But if you can't support me there, just leaving a like or a comment is always appreciated. Hope you guys have enjoyed this look at the SL18 and what it stands for insofar as the Japanese cloning the Auto 5 and maybe arguably in a certain context, if you look at it just right, doing it better than the Belgians had. And I hope that you'll stick around and enjoy the brief shooting segment before we go ahead and wrap everything up. And until next time, you guys take it easy. Well, we're outside here with our SL18, and we're just going to have a very brief shooting segment with it. The reason for that is because, as we showed when we were taking it apart, this is a fit and function clone of the Auto 5. It handles like an Auto 5, it feels like an Auto 5, it shoots like an Auto 5. It really is a better clone of the Auto 5 than even the Model 11, because of course we have our magazine cut off on this side of the gun. Really the one thing that differs is Herter's face on the side instead of John Browning's. But we'll go ahead and get the thing loaded up. Of course, later iterations of this gun, the non-Herter, so the Nikko Singer Daiwa guns, did have the Browning two-piece lifter eventually. This gun does not have the two-piece carrier, so we have to depress the button there on the side of the receiver to be able to load it. There's 3, and finally our 4th round to bring the gun up to a total capacity of 5. I think we go ahead and shoot these, maybe 2 from the shoulder, 3 from the hip, overlay maybe a little bit of slow-mo or a little bit of sort of B-roll style shooting, and then send you guys on your way, because this thing really is, for all intents and purposes, just an Auto 5. I mean, you can't really argue with that. It just shoots really well. If you close your eyes and someone hands you this and says this is a Japanese manufacturer Moroku Browning, the only thing that would really key you off is the slight difference in the shape of the grip. And that's very slight. Everything else feels practically the same. It's a very similar feeling, handling, shooting gun.